Thank you, Mr. Lee. No, I was going to use that. I don't know what's going on with it. Just watch that clock. Well, good afternoon, brethren. Finally, we have some snow, beautiful, beautiful snow. I know most of you don't feel that way, but it is beautiful outside. Just not when you got the shovel in your hand, maybe. Today I'm going to be using the New King James and occasionally the New American Standard. I'll let you know when I switch over to that one. And I want to start off with a question. Please don't raise your hand. You can just answer this in your seat in your notes if you so wish. Do you know anyone that keeps Christmas? I want to start off by reading something. This is Don't Hurt to Ask by Trey Gowdy. There's a section in here I want to read. Words matter. If you watched the news this week, you might have found someone that said, yes, words do matter. And concepts matter too. So this is Trey Gowdy. He had a family friend that her son was in college. He was a math major. And he wanted to ask some questions. And I'm going to read through this just so you can see how confusing sometimes you can get somebody. So he starts off talking to him. He says, what is 3 times 0? I asked the young David Mahaffey. He looked at me like I had lost my mind. It's 0, Mr. Gowdy. Everybody knows that. I don't know about that, David. I don't think it is. 0 times 3 is 0, I agree, but 3 times 0 is not. I'm sorry, Mr. Gowdy, but it is. Says who? Says everyone, Mr. Gowdy. Am I not someone, David? Are you minimizing my existence because I have a different view of nothingness than you do? Am I not someone? Do I not matter, David? Mr. Gowdy, anything times 0 is 0, David replied. No, David, I don't believe that. 3 times 0 is 3. You cannot make what I had disappear. I had 3 of something. I multiplied it by nothing, but my 3 did not disappear. And I am not going to allow you to act as if something doesn't exist when you conceded in the equation that it did. I can't allow that. I won't stand for that. It would be wrong, David. Would you want me to do that, David? Would you want me to act as if something that exists does not exist? By this time, the head golf professional, both assistant golf professionals, and a half dozen cart room workers were standing around us. I live for these moments. David, I love you. I've known your family forever. Your grandfather taught me physics. Your grandmother taught me English. I was there when your father had his first hole-in-one. By the way, are you telling me your father didn't really have a hole-in-one because you weren't present for it? Is that what you mean by nothing? 0 times 3 is 0, I concede. I started with nothing, and nothing times 3 is still nothing. But 3 times 0 is not nothing. I have 3 of something. Are you saying I don't? Are you denying that I have 3 of something? Are you suspending reality because you want to win a math argument in front of your peers? David, where is my 3? Where did it go? How can you act as if it does not exist? There is no more math formula you can devise that will convince me to ignore something I know existed. You cannot will it away, and I am frankly surprised and disappointed you would try. Where's my 3, David? As you can see, he backed that young man right into a corner. He didn't know what to say to that crazy old guy that was going on and on and on about this 3. I read that to make a point that sometimes we don't necessarily understand our concepts well enough we can explain them to someone else. And the idea for this split sermon came from a sermon I heard in Snowshoe back in 2018. It was given by Mr. Bart Bornhorst, and the name of the sermon was Keep the Feast. And during that sermon, he relates a story that his wife told him. When she was just a young girl, she grew up in the church. Some of her friends come up and said, what are you going to do for Christmas? And she says, oh, we don't keep Christmas. And her friends all looked at her. What do you mean you don't keep Christmas? It's not that they didn't understand that she didn't do anything for Christmas or that she didn't observe Christmas. They didn't understand this keep Christmas. They didn't know what that meant. And so today, the title of the sermon, what do you mean, keep? I'm going to go through what it means when we use the phrase keep the feast, and some other things in the Bible. Keep the feast is pretty much Church of God lingo. I don't think you'll hear it outside of any Sabbath-keeping Church of God congregations. Maybe some other Sabbath-keeping groups that do observe the feast might use it, but it's pretty much church lingo. It's so much church lingo, in fact, I was listening to a telecast from a different group on Christmas, and they used the phrase, should a Christian keep Christmas? And I'm thinking, boom, wow, you just lost half the audience right there because they don't know what you mean by keep Christmas. Merriam Webster, definition of keep. It's got a lot of definitions. The first one is the transitive verb. I didn't know what a transitive verb was. I had to look it up. Transitive means that the verb has a direct object or an indirect object. So it answers the question what or whom. So the first definition is to retain in one's possession or power, such as the old saying, finders keepers, losers weepers. You keep it. The second one is to take notice of by appropriate conduct. So you would keep a promise, or they use the example actually of keep the Sabbath. And the third one is to watch over or defend, as in to keep someone from harm. And there's a lot more definitions. There's the intransitive form, and the intransitive form answers where, when, or how type questions, so you can keep talking. It tells you how long you're going to talk, or I'm going to keep talking. And I'll try not to keep talking too long, mister. Look at that, just names that go out of my head. Lacoste, there it is. And finally, there's another form of it. It's a noun, a keep. Probably most of us don't know what a keep is. A keep was the most secure part of a castle. And when the King James Bible was written, everybody knew what a keep was. Keep was part of their terminology that they used all the time. So maybe when they made their translation of the Bible, it made a whole lot sense to them than it does to us. He asked two questions at the beginning of that sermon. How are you planning to keep the feast? And God commands us to keep the feast. I guess the second one's not a question, it's a statement. So two different things there. How do you want to keep the feast? And God commands us to keep the feast. And the reason he had the two statements is because there's two different words that are translated keep in this instance. We just sang this verse, but if you'll turn with me to Psalm 42, we'll start off Psalm 42. In Psalm 42, we'll start in verse 1, and we'll go down to verse 4. Verse 1, as the deer pants for the water brooks, so pants my soul for you, O God. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. When shall I come and appear before God? As we just sang that song, the psalmist here is really trying to express how much he really loves God, how much he wants to be with God. Verse 3, my tears have been my food day and night, while they continually say to me, where is your God? So he's been separated from his God, and he doesn't like it. In verse 4, when I remember these things, I pour out my soul within me. For I used to go with the multitude, I went with them to the house of God, with the voice of joy and praise, with a multitude that kept a pilgrim feast. Kept a pilgrim feast is the way the word keep, used in other places in the Bible, is translated here. And I'll give you that word in just a minute. It's used 16 times in the Bible. 12 times it's used as keep. This is one of the ones that's not. In Exodus 5, verse 1, one that you're very, very familiar with, the story of the Exodus. Moses is talking to Pharaoh. In the beginning of the chapter there, Exodus 5, verse 1, it says, and afterward Moses and Aaron went in and told Pharaoh, thus says the Lord God of Israel, let my people go, that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness. And this is the same word that we just saw in Psalm 42. Quite often we ask people, where are you going for the feast? It's a pilgrimage to keep a feast. That Hebrew word is C-H-A-G-A-G, kagag, and it means to make a pilgrimage or to keep a pilgrim feast. And as you can see, as I go on here, it means some other things too. Strong's defines it as to celebrate, dance, keep, hold a solemn feast, holiday, or reel to and fro. So I just read two of the scriptures that don't translate it as keep. The other two is 1 Samuel 30, verse 16, is where it's translated as dancing, and that's where David has come after the Amalekites that just pillaged a bunch of towns, and they were dancing in celebration. So they were having a celebration, and they were dancing. And in Psalm 107, verse 27, it talks about a ship on the sea, and the waves are tossing it about, and the men are reeling back and forth on the ship. And that obviously seems to be a reference to somebody that's been celebrating and been drinking a lot and can't walk in a straight line. So obviously they use that word celebrate kind of like we might use the word celebrate too for partying. Now I'd like to turn to Leviticus 23. Leviticus 23, verse 39. And I may have to step this up here a little bit. Leviticus 23. In the first half of the chapter, as you're probably all very much familiar, it goes through laying out all of the different holy days of God. And interestingly enough, through all of that detail on how to observe it, it doesn't once say, keep the feast, or anything like that. It's only in verse 39 where they're all done going through it and he starts to summarize, and specifically on the Feast of Tabernacles. Verse 39, also on the 15th day of the 7th month, when you have gathered in the fruit of the land, you shall keep the feast of the Lord for 7 days. And on the first day there shall be a Sabbath rest, and on the 8th day a Sabbath rest. And you will take for yourselves on the first day the fruit of beautiful trees, branches of palm trees, boughs of leafy trees, willows of the brook, and you shall rejoice before the eternal your God for 7 days. And you shall keep it as a feast to the Lord for 7 days in the year. It shall be a statute forever in your generations. You shall celebrate it in the 7th month. Now, if I read it through again in the New American Standard, instead of the word keep the feast, they use celebrate the feast. And that's probably a more accurate definition of what the intent of the scripture is here. We're to celebrate when we keep these feast days. It's supposed to be a time of rejoicing. It's supposed to be a fun time. But when he gives what you're supposed to do on each one of these days, because he's laying out sacrifices, whether you have leaven or don't have leaven, all the stuff you're supposed to do or not do, not eat on Day of Atonement, doesn't talk anything about celebrating on the feast days. So celebrate. Merriam Webster again. To do something special or enjoyable for an important event, occasion, holiday, etc. And interesting enough, the first thing they put is to celebrate Christmas. Now, if that young lady at the beginning of my message had said, we don't celebrate Christmas, the girls wouldn't have got a puzzled look on their face. They might have wondered why she didn't celebrate Christmas, but they at least would have known what she was talking about. Some of the other definitions is to have or participate in a party or a drinking spree or uninhibited good time. With the expression, you look like you were up celebrating all night. Some synonyms for the word are carouse, feast, party, revel, and make merry. That's not all of them. There's bunches of them. And keep is actually one of them too. They probably got that from the Bible. Now, that is not what the Bible means when they say celebrate the feast. And if you want to have a good message on what it means to keep the feast in the proper way, you can go to the sermon I referenced at the beginning of this message. He goes, that's the entire gist of his sermon, is keeping the feast God's way. So that's the first word, only used 16 times, only 12 times is keep the feast, and yet it is ingrained in our culture, in our vocabulary completely. Now there's a second word. I'm not going to have you flip to all of these scriptures, but so I'm going to start off beginning in Genesis here. Chapter 2, verse 15, probably have a lot of these memorized. If not, you'll know it the second I start speaking it. Then the eternal God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to tend and keep it. So he's supposed to keep the garden. And here's another one you'll recognize. Chapter 4, verse 9. Then the Eternal said to Cain, where is Abel your brother? And he said, I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper? And here's one you will recognize, but it doesn't have the word keep in it, but it does have the gist of what the word really means in the Hebrew. And that's in chapter 3, verse 24. I'm going to read the King James Version does have the word keep in it, and I'm going to read the King James Version first. So he drove out the man, and he placed at the east of the Garden of Eden cherubims, and a flaming sword which turned every way, to keep the way of the tree of life. Actually, in the New King James, it says to guard the way to the tree of life. And that Hebrew word is shamar, S-H-A-M-A-R. It means to keep, to watch, or to preserve. It occurs 469 times. And we'll run through all of them real quick here. Actually, the opposite of keep is to neglect. So, this form of keep. So let's look at Exodus 23, verses 14 through 16. We'll go ahead and read that one. Exodus 23, verses 14 and 16. You might tell that I went for the first examples of many of these words that I could find, so we're kind of at the front of the Bible today. We will get a little bit further back in a little bit. Exodus 23, verses 14 through 16, it says, 3 times you shall keep a feast to me in the year. You shall keep the feast of unleavened bread. You shall not eat unleavened bread 7 days, as I commanded you at the time appointed in the month of Abib, for in it you came out of Egypt. None shall appear before me empty. And the feast of harvest, the first fruits of your labors which you have sown in the field, and the feast of ingathering at the end of the year, when you have gathered in the fruit of your labors from the field. You notice that the word keep is used here twice. And the reason I chose the scripture is because both Hebrew words are used. In verse 14 it says, 3 times you shall keep a feast to me in the year. That is the one for celebrate. 3 times in a year, celebrate at my feasts. But then in verse 15, you shall keep the feast of unleavened bread, the feast of harvest, and the feast of ingathering, taking out all the intermediate words. And that one means you're supposed to guard those days. Guard those days. We're supposed to celebrate, enjoy, and rejoice on the holy days. But most importantly, we're to remember them and guard them from letting them slip away. Exodus 31, 12 through 17. Exodus 31, 12 through 17. And the Eternal spoke to Moses, saying, speak also to the children of Israel, saying, surely my Sabbaths you shall keep. For it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I am the Eternal who sanctifies you. Notice it says my Sabbaths. It doesn't say just the Sabbath. My Sabbaths you shall keep. All of them are supposed to be protected, guarded. We're supposed to hold them important. You shall keep the Sabbath, therefore, for it is holy to you. Everyone who profanes it shall surely be put to death, for whoever does any work on it, that person shall be cut off from among his people. Work shall be done for 6 days, but the 7th is a Sabbath of rest, holy to the Eternal. Whoever does any work on a Sabbath day, he shall surely be put to death. Therefore the children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, to observe the Sabbath throughout their generations as a perpetual covenant. It is a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. For in 6 days the Eternal made the heavens and the earth, and on the 7th day he rested and was refreshed. We know that the 4th commandment starts off with the word remember. Remember Sabbath day. That's the gist of what we're talking about here. Remember it, guard it, protect it, In Exodus 12, 14 through 17, again, it goes through this one, speaking specifically only of unleavened bread in this one. It says, verse 14, so this day shall be to you a memorial. You shall keep it as a feast to the eternal throughout your generations. You shall keep it as a feast by an everlasting ordinance. And down in verse 17, I'll skip verses in 15 and 16. Verse 17, it says, so you shall observe the feast of unleavened bread, for on the same day I will have brought your armies out of the land of Egypt. Therefore you shall observe this day throughout your generations as an everlasting ordinance. That word observe, again, is the same word. What other things in the Bible are we to keep? Because this isn't just about keeping the feast, although that is the lingo I started off with, but there's other things that God says that we should keep, other things we should guard in our lives. Genesis 17, verse 9, probably memory verse for many of you, maybe not word for word, but when I read it, you'll know it. Genesis 17, verse 9, and God said to Abraham, as for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your descendants after you throughout your generations. So Abraham was told by God to keep the covenant that he had made with God. And we've all made a covenant with God. At the time of baptism, we made a covenant with God. Genesis 25, verse 5, it's a little more broad. And this one, again, another one that you're probably very familiar with. Because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. So all of these things are supposed to be kept, supposed to be guarded, supposed to be protected. The charge, the commandments, the statutes, and his laws. Deuteronomy 4 has an interesting one. In Deuteronomy 4, and I didn't put down the scriptures because I didn't know if I'd have enough time, and I think I'll just skip it, but it says you're supposed to keep yourselves. Take heed to yourselves is another term. It says keep yourselves and take heed to yourselves. So we're supposed to protect ourselves from leaving God's presence, protect ourselves from the world's influence, protect ourselves from bad company. We're supposed to protect ourselves and keep ourselves holy. Moving on to the New Testament, there is a Greek equivalent. It's T-E-R-E-O, tereo, and it means the exact same thing, to watch over, to guard. Matthew 19:17. So we could turn to the New Testament. Matthew 19, verse 17. Words of Jesus, again, probably very familiar to you. And I guess that's one thing with the sermon, is because we use the terminology keep so much, most of these scriptures are very, very familiar with us. Matthew 19, verse 17. So he said to him, he being Jesus Christ at this time, why do you call me good? No one is good but one, that is God. But if you want to enter into life, keep the commandments. As we saw back in Genesis 25, Abraham was blessed by God because he kept the commandments, laws, statutes, and charges. Jesus here himself says, keep the commandments. And again, as I was a young person, when I read these things, keep the commandments, I just thought, okay, that just means obey them. I'll obey them. I'll keep the letter of the law. That's another phrase we use. But if you look at Merriam's, there's nowhere in that description where it says keep means obey. It's not there. John 8, 48 through 51. John 8, 48 through 51. Something else that we're told to keep. Something else. In John 8, verse 48. And then the Jews answered and said to him, do we not say rightly that you are a Samaritan and have a demon? They're speaking to Jesus. Verse 49, and Jesus answered, I do not have a demon, but I honor my Father, and you dishonor me. And I do not seek my own glory. There is one who seeks and judges. Most assuredly I say to you, if anyone keeps my word, he shall never see death. So here it's expanded even more. Jesus is saying, keep my word. And as we know, the first 4 books in the New Testament The gospel message is full of Jesus' word. We got the Sermon on the Mount and how he expanded the Ten Commandments and to help us understand the intent of them and what we're supposed to be doing. So we're supposed to keep those words. We're supposed to protect them. We're supposed to be careful with them. In John 14 and 15, again, I'm not going to go to specific verses in here. John 14 and 15 is the last Passover there, just before Jesus was taken and crucified. Repeatedly, he's talking to the disciples about keeping the commandments and keeping his word. It's mentioned 4 or 5 different verses in there. Keep my commandments, keep my word. You've kept my commandments, you've kept my word. So that's keeping and things we're supposed to guard and protect. Let's go back to the first word we had in the Hebrew and see the Greek equivalent there. 1 Corinthians 5:8, only one time this Greek word is used in the New Testament. 1 Corinthians 5:8. And again, memory verse. If not a memory verse, you know it because we go to it every year, all the time. 1 Corinthians 5:8, therefore let us keep the feast. There's that phrase again that's part of our culture. Keep the feast, not with old leaven, nor with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. The Greek word there, and I'm not going to try to pronounce it. I'll try to pronounce the root word. The root word is hairtazo. You throw an M-E-N on the end. It's just too many vowel consonants for me. It means I keep a feast. It's the only place that's used in the New Testament. But if you go again to the New American Standard, the intent here is to celebrate. They translate it, therefore let us celebrate the feast. I didn't write down their exact words, and I don't have a New American Standard, but I think what they say is let us celebrate the feast. They definitely say celebrate instead of keep. So what are you going to be doing for Christmas? That was the question that was asked at the beginning. Strangely enough, and I did not expect this in my research, there's a Greek word out there. It's called poieo, P-O-I-E-O, and it means to make or to do. Matthew 26:18. Matthew 26:18. I was very surprised by this. That kind of altered the way my message went because I had a different idea of what I was going to do with that. What are you going to do for Christmas phrase? But here it is. Matthew 26, verse 18. And he said, again, he being Jesus Christ, go into the city to a certain man and say to him, the teacher says, my time is at hand. I will keep the Passover at your house with my disciples. Poieo. I'm going to go do the Passover. I'm going to do the Passover. Or you might even say, I'm going to make the Passover, since this was the first time he put the Passover in this, with the new bread and wine, whatever the word is that describes that. But it's not the only time this is used for the feast. I use another one in Acts 18:21, and you don't need to turn to that one. Acts 18, verse 21, this is Paul, and he's saying, but he took leave of them, saying, I must by all means keep this coming feast in Jerusalem, but I will return again to you, God willing, and he sailed from Ephesus. So he had to go from Ephesus to Jerusalem because he was going to do the feast in Jerusalem. I was kind of surprised they didn't use the word celebrate, and I don't know why in the New Testament it goes away from celebrate so much into this doing the feast, but it did. But there's one more thing that's kept in the Bible that I haven't mentioned. Let's jump back to Genesis again. Genesis 28, verse 15. Genesis 28, verse 15. Behold, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go and will bring you back to this land. For I will not leave you until I have done what I have spoken to you. This is God speaking to the children of Israel, that he's going to keep them. And in Numbers 6, verses 22 through 26. Probably, again, scriptures that, if not memorized, you'll recognize immediately. And the Eternal spoke to Moses, saying, speak to Aaron and his son, saying, this is the way you shall bless the children of Israel. Say to them. So this is God telling Moses, this is how you're going to bless the children of Israel. This isn't something Moses made up. This is God saying it. Verse 24, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. So God said, Moses, when you bless the children of Israel, tell them, I'm going to keep them. I'm going to guard them. I'm going to protect them. That is my blessing. Finally, when we're talking about the Last Supper that Jesus instituted in John 17, there's one set of scriptures here I want to read because, again, it goes along with what I just read, but it's in the New Testament, and I think it's very impactful. John 17, verses 9 through 15. This is Jesus praying. I pray for them. I do not pray for the world, but for those whom you have given me, for they are yours. And all mine are yours, and yours are mine, and I am glorified in them. Now I am no longer in the world, but these are in the world. I come to you, Holy Father. Keep through your name those whom you have given me, that they may be one as we are. While I was with them in the world, I kept them in your name. Those whom you gave me I have kept, and none of them is lost except the son of perdition, that the scripture might be fulfilled. I want to stop there and look at that a little bit closer. Twice there in one verse, it's translated, I kept them, I have kept. Two different words, two different Greek words. The first one is I kept them as in I guarded them, I protected them. The second one, those you gave me, I have kept, is much more personal. It's I have kept them. A very, very personal approach to this protecting and guarding people. And you might recall that Jesus told Peter, Satan wants to sift you, but it wasn't allowed. It was not allowed. He was protected. He was kept. But now I come to you, and these things I speak in the world, that they may have my joy fulfilled in themselves. I have given them your word, and the world has hated them because they are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. I do not pray that you should take them out of the world, but that you should keep them from the evil one. Just as I spoke that Satan was after Peter. So to keep the feast is a Church of God phrase. It's taken from the Bible. It's taken from King James English and carried forward for the most part. Some of the newer translations have modified it some to celebrate in some places. But I didn't see in my research, and I didn't have as much time to research as I wanted to. I had a hard time getting this to settle down and do what I wanted it to. But I didn't see any place where they said, you know, guard the feast days, protect these feast days. I didn't see that in any translations. We've looked at 5 different words, 2 Hebrew words, 3 Greek words that are all translated into keep. God instructs us to celebrate his holy days. He also instructs us to guard them. Not only the holy days, but all of his words. And he also says that he will guard us. By the way, do you know anyone that keeps Christmas?